Hi guys, welcome back to the next day of the Book of Joy. We are reading today, Nothing Beautiful Comes Without Some Suffering. Archbishop, you were talking about how the Dalai Lama has experienced great suffering in his exile. During apartheid, you and your country experienced great suffering too. And even in your personal life, you've dealt with prostate cancer. You're dealing with it now. Many people, when they get ill, don't feel very joyful. You've been able to maintain that joy in the face of suffering. How have you been able to do it? Well, I've certainly been helped by many other people. One of the good things is realizing that you are not a solitary cell. You are part of a wonderful community. That's helped very greatly. As we were saying, if you are setting out to be joyful, you're not going to end up being joyful. You're going to find yourself turned in on yourself. It's like a flower. You open, you blossom, really because of other people. And I think some suffering, maybe even intense suffering, is a necessary ingredient for life, certainly for developing compassion. You know, when Nelson Mandela went to jail, he was young and you can almost say bloodthirsty. He was head of the armed wing of the African National Congress, his party. He spent 27 years in jail, and many would say, 27 years, oh, what a waste. And I think people are surprised when I say no, the 27 years were necessary. They were necessary to remove the dross. The suffering in prison helped him to become more magnanimous, willing to listen to the other side, to discover that the people he regarded as his enemy, they too were human beings who had fears and expectations. And they had been molded by their society. And so without the 27 years, I don't think we would have seen the Nelson Mandela with the compassion, the magnanimity, the capacity to put himself in the shoes of the other. While the racist apartheid government in South Africa imprisoned Nelson Mandela and so many other political leaders, the Archbishop became the de facto ambassador of the anti-apartheid struggle. Protected by his Anglican robes and the Nobel Prize that he received in 1984, he was able to campaign for an end to the oppression of blacks and other people of color in South Africa. During that bloody struggle, he buried countless men, women, and children and tirelessly preached peace and forgiveness at their funerals. After the release of Nelson Mandela and his election as the first president of a free South Africa, the Archbishop was asked to create the famed Truth and Reconciliation Commission to try to find a peaceful way to confront the atrocities of apartheid and pioneer a new future without revenge and retribution. And in a kind of paradoxical way, the Archbishop continued, it is how we face all of the things that seem to be negative in our lives that determines the kind of person we become. If we regard all of this as frustrating, we're going to come out squeezed and tight and just angry and wishing to smash everything. When I spoke about mothers and childbirth, it seems to be a wonderful metaphor. Actually, that nothing beautiful in the end comes without a measure of pain, some frustration, some suffering. That is the nature of things. That is how our universe has been made up. Later, I was amazed to hear from prenatal researcher Pathak Wadhwa that there is indeed some kind of biological law at work in these situations. Stress and opposition turn out to be exactly what initiate our development in utero. Our stem cells do not differentiate and become us if there is not enough biological stress to encourage them to do so. Without stress and opposition, complex life like ours would never have developed. We would never have come into being. If you want to be a good writer, the Archbishop concluded, you are not going to become one by always going to the movies and eating bonbons. You have to sit down and write, which can be very frustrating, and yet without that, you would not get that good result. There was deep truth in what the Archbishop was saying, and yet I wanted to repeat back to him what he had said to the Dalai Lama. It's one thing to understand the value of suffering and quite another to remember it when you are angry or frustrated or in pain. Archbishop, take us with you to the hospital or to a doctor's appointment, and they're probing you and prodding you, and it's painful and it's uncomfortable. And you're waiting, and it takes a long time. What do you do inside yourself to not feel angry or to complain or to wallow in your self-pity? It sounds like you're saying that you can choose to be joyful even in the face of that difficulty. How do you do that? I think we ought not to make people feel guilty when it is painful. It is painful, and you have to acknowledge that it is painful. But actually, in the midst of that pain, you can recognize the gentleness of the nurse who is looking after you. You can see the skill of the surgeon who is going to be performing the operation on you. Yet sometimes the pain can be so intense that you do not even have the capacity to do that. The thing is, don't feel guilty. We have no control over our feelings. Emotions are spontaneous things that arise. This was the point that the Archbishop and Dalai Lama would disagree on during the week. How much control do we have over our emotions? The Archbishop would say that we have very little. The Dalai Lama would say that we have more than we think. At some point you will be in anguish, the Archbishop continued. We are told in the Christian tradition to offer up our suffering and unite it with the anguish and pain of our Savior, and thus use it to improve the world. It does help you not to be too self-centered. It helps you to some extent to look away from yourself, and it can help to make that anguish bearable. You don't have to be a believer in any faith to be able to say, oh, aren't I blessed that I have doctors, that I have nurses qualified to look after me, and that I can be in a hospital. That might just be the beginning of moving away from being so self-centered and concentrating too much on me, 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 me. You begin to realize, hey, I'm not alone in this. Look at all the many others, and there may be some who are in greater pain. It's like being put into a fiery furnace to be refined. The Dalai Lama jumped in to affirm the truth of what the Archbishop was saying. Too much self-centered thinking is the source of suffering. A compassionate concern for others' well-being is the source of happiness. I do not have as much experience with physical pain as you have. Yet one day I was in Bodh Gaya, the place where the Buddha achieved enlightenment, to begin a series of important Buddhist teachings. Bodh Gaya is the holiest pilgrimage place for Buddhists. There were around 100,000 people who had come to attend the teachings, but suddenly I had intense pain in my abdomen. They did not know then that it was my gallbladder, but I was told I needed to go to the hospital urgently. When bouts of pain struck, it was so intense that I was sweating. We had to drive to the hospital in Patna, the capital city of the state of Bihar, which was 2 hours away. As we were driving along the road, we passed a lot of poverty. Bihar is one of the poorest states in India. I could see out of the window that the children had no shoes, and I knew that they were not getting a proper education. Then as we approached Patna, under a hut, I saw an old man lying on the ground. His hair was disheveled, his clothes were dirty, and he looked sick. He had no one to take care of him. Really, he looked as if he were dying. All the way to the hospital, I was thinking of this man and felt his suffering, and I completely forgot about my own pain. By simply shifting my focus to another person, which is what compassion does, my own pain was much less intense. This is how compassion works, even at the physical level. So as you rightly mentioned, a self-centered attitude is the source of the problem. We have to take care of ourselves without selfishly taking care of ourselves. If we don't take care of ourselves, we cannot survive. We need to do that. We should have wise selfishness rather than foolish selfishness. Foolish selfishness means that you only think of yourself, don't care about others, bully others, exploit others. In fact, taking care of others, helping others, ultimately is the way to discover your own joy and to have a happy life. So that is what I call wise selfishness. You are wise, the Archbishop said. I wouldn't just say wise selfish. You are wise. The Buddhist practice of mind training, called Lojong in Tibetan, is an important part of the Dalai Lama's tradition. One of the fundamental messages in the original 12th century Lojong text echoes what the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop were saying about looking away from oneself. All Dharma teachings agree on one point, lessening one's self-absorption. The text clarifies that when we focus on ourselves, we are destined to be unhappy. Contemplate that as long as you are too focused on your self-importance and too caught up in thinking about how you are good or bad, you will experience suffering. Obsessing about getting what you want and avoiding what you don't want does not result in happiness. The text includes the admonition, always maintain only a joyful mind. So what then is this joyful mind? Jinpa, who wrote a translation and commentary on this revered text, explained as we were preparing for the trip that joy is our essential nature, something everyone can realize. We could say that our desire for happiness is, in a way, an attempt to rediscover our original state of mind. It seems that Buddhists believe that joy is the natural state, but that the ability to experience joy can also be cultivated as a skill. As we were hearing, so much depends on where we put our attention, on our own suffering or that of others, on our own perceived separation or on our indivisible connection. Our ability to cultivate joy has not been scientifically studied as thoroughly as our ability to cultivate happiness. In 1978, psychologists Philip Brickman, Dan Coates, and Ronnie Janoff Bullman published a landmark study that found that lottery winners were not significantly happier than those who had been paralyzed in an accident. From this and subsequent work came the idea that people have a set point that determines their happiness over the course of their life. In other words, we get accustomed to any new situation and inevitably return to our general state of happiness. However, more recent research by psychologist Sonia Lyubomirsky suggests that perhaps only 50% of our happiness is determined by immutable factors like our genes or temperament, our set point. The other half is determined by a combination of our circumstances, over which we may have limited control, and our attitudes and actions, over which we have a great deal of control. According to Lyubomirsky, the three factors that seem to have the greatest influence on increasing our happiness are our ability to reframe the situation more positively, our ability to experience gratitude, and our choice to be kind and generous. These were exactly the attitudes and actions that the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop had already mentioned, and to which they would return as central pillars of joy. All right, tomorrow we will return with the next chapter. I hope you enjoyed that one. Talk to you soon.